in selections from Likkutei Sichos, where it's a Sicha from Chelik Gimel Likkutei Sichos, and it analyzes right away at the beginning of the parsha. There speaks about the word lifneihem, what that means and what is the meaning of it, and so on. So the Rebbe begins in 1, commenting on the verse, Ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem, and these are the laws which you'll place before them. Our sages and rabbis offer several interpretations of the Hebrew word lifneihem, translated in the simple meaning of the text as before them. One explanation that the Chazal say, legal issues must be adjudicated before them, meaning before Jewish judges, and not before non-Jews. When there is a dispute between Jews, they must settle it before Jewish judges who rule according to Torah law and not before non-Jewish magistrates. Even when the secular law is no different than that of the Torah, litigation must be brought before a rabbinical court. That's why it says the word lifnei, and before them, the Jewish judges. A deeper meaning of the concept of lifneim, lifneihem, shares its root with the Hebrew word panim, literally meaning face. However, it also has several other meanings, including inner dimension. In this context, the verse instructs that a student being taught the Torah's laws should be exposed to their inner dimensions, their underlying reasons, how and what led the law to be promulgated in this type of way. He should not be taught the laws as a dry canon, but should be shown their motivating principles. Instead of telling a student, this is the law, and discover the motivating principles yourself, the teacher should explain the concepts in a manner which sits well within the student's understanding. The third level is, according to the Alter Rebbe, lifneihem, inner dimensions, refers to the students, their pnimius, that you have to give it into their inner part, into reaching into the depth of the student. The Torah's judgments enable the knowledge of Hashem to be implanted in the inner dimensions of a Jew's soul, what's called das in Elikus. Within our spiritual makeup, we have a number of different levels, some revealed and some hidden. The Torah must permeate even the innermost and deeply hidden dimensions of our souls. Like all concepts of Chassidus, the above is also alluded to in Nigla, the revealed dimensions of Torah law. Commenting on the above verse, Talmud Yerushalmi associates the word tasim, translated as you shall place, with the Hebrew word sima, even though they are spelled differently, but the Chazal a lot of times make drushes based on the similarities of how words sound similar to each other. And what is sima meaning? A treasure trove that refers to the inner and hidden dimensions of the Torah. That is the treasure. So that's what the Yerushalmi already says, similar to what the Alter Rebbe would explain many years later when the hidden dimensions of the Torah are placed lifneihem. In other words, you have the treasure, they arouse the hidden inner dimensions of the soul. As mentioned on several occasions, the Rebbe says that he mentioned this many times, when our Chazal, when our sages offer different interpretations of the same word in the Torah, all the interpretations share a connection. Thus, it is necessary to ask, what is the connection between these three different interpretations of lifneihem? That is question number 1. Another question the Rebbe is going to pose is another point requires clarification. The Torah teaches all these directives implied by the word lifneihem specifically in connection with the mitzvahs that are referred to as Mishpatim, meaning it is the mitzvahs categorized as Mishpatim that are to be placed before them with all the multiple meanings of lifneihem that we mentioned before. As is well known, the mitzvahs of the Torah are divided into 3 categories: Chokim, Eidus, and Mishpatim, as the Rebbe will explain all of these 3. These 3 categories reflect the different degree to which a particular mitzvah can be comprehended by our logic and understood by us. The mitzvahs described as chukim do not have a rationale that can be grasped by the human mind. Instead, they are to be fulfilled solely because Hashem commanded their observance. They are chukah chakakti gzeira gozarti, statutes which I have ordained, decrees which I have issued, to be observed even though one does not understand them at all. Eidos, by contrast, are mitzvahs whose rationale can be grasped by our minds. However, had the Torah not commanded them, human logic would not obligate their observance. We would not propose such practices on the basis of our own logic. Nevertheless, once the Torah has given such commands, we can comprehend and explain the rationale. Mishpatim represents the category of mitzvahs that even human logic mandates, meaning human logic not only accepts the observance of these practices after the fact, like we mentioned about Eidos, that once we've been commanded, we can understand them. But it requires, human logic requires their observance. That is what Mishpatim are. And the Rebbe is going to bring examples from what Chazal quote. In this vein, the Chazal say, our sages said, if, heaven forbid, the Torah had not been given, we would have learned modesty from a cat and the prohibition against theft from an ant. For even without the Torah's commandment of theft and modesty, our own minds would have dictated the observance of this type of mitzvah. That's what the Mishpatim kinds of mitzvahs are. Nevertheless, the Torah specifically states that the Mishpatim should be placed lifneim, and now we're going to analyze in all three meanings of lifneim, why are we connecting it with Mishpatim? A question arises, why are the lessons derived from lifneihem more closely associated with mishpatim than with Eidos and chukim, which is the pasuk in our parsha? It says ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. So it's the mishpatim specifically that the Torah points out that we have to make sure that they are lifneihem. So the Rebbe will begin that in the first explanation of lifneihem, we can understand why it's specifically by mishpatim. A resolution can be offered according to the first interpretation of lifneihem, for only with regard to mishpatim is it possible for non-Jewish judges to rule in the same manner as Jews. With regards to Eidos, these are like their testimonial, ceremonial laws that Hashem told us. Let's say keep Shabbos to remember that Hashem created the world, or Pesach because of we went out of Mitzrayim. And certainly with regard to chukim like shatnez and so on, there is no need to forewarn against approaching non-Jewish judges. It's obvious. For it is obvious that a non-Jew can't relate to such laws. What are you going to go ask a non-Jewish law, and you're going to go to the Supreme Court of the United States and ask them, so what's the din if I had my meat and milk got mixed up? Where does it even apply to them? A non-Jewish judge's rulings can stem only from logic, not from a source that transcends human intellect. However, since Mishpatim involve matters that fall within the scope of human intellect, it is possible that non-Jews will rule in the same manner as the Torah prescribes, because Mishpatim are civil laws, understood laws, rational laws. Therefore, it is necessary for the Torah to clarify that even in those laws that it seems to be that non-Jews will rule in the same way that Torah rules, therefore it is necessary to clarify that Jews must bring their disputes before a Jewish court. But the Rebbe is going to say, but in the following two ideas of lifneihem, it's not understood what mishpatim has to do with them. The second interpretation, however, that when teaching a student, one should expose them to the motivating principles behind the laws, so that he will understand them thoroughly and internalize them, to understand how the law is derived from the psukim, what reasoning was there, for example, in the Gemara and Halacha to come to this conclusion, and so on. So, seems more appropriate for Eidos, and even more so regarding chukim. Our unaided minds do not obligate the observance of Eidos, and chukim are entirely above our conceptual grasp. Like we said before, that Eidus a person wouldn't come up with on her own. That's what it means, unaided minds. And Chukim for sure is not something that's part of human intellect. Accordingly, in the process of education, it would be seemingly necessary to emphasize that such mitzvahs that are not something that is based wholly and entirely on human logic, should and must be conveyed in a manner that facilitates internalization. Show him the psukim from which to derive, how did the Chachamim learn out all these different things, and so on. However, this message appears unnecessary regarding Mishpatim. Since logic compels the observance of the mitzvahs in that category, it is obvious that the instruction should be conveyed in a manner that relates to the student and enables him to internalize it. You don't need to have a special pasuk in the Torah, an extra word to tell you, it has to be lifnei, and make sure that the student internalizes it. The whole idea of Mishpatim is logic and internalization, and therefore it would be obvious that the teacher would help the student internalize it. The Rebbe goes on now in the third explanation of lifneihem, the Alter Rebbe's explanation. Neither does the interpretation of lifneihem as to your inner dimensions seem to relate to Mishpatim. In order to observe the Mishpatim, it does not appear necessary to arouse the inner dimensions of our souls, for these mitzvahs are also obligated by our logic. We don't need to come on to the inner dimension of our souls. We don't need to inspire ourselves and arouse ourselves. Our own mind tells us to do it, so we don't need any special deep inspiration that comes from what Alter Rebbe spoke about, das and elikus, that awakens the soul, and so on. Since Chukim, by contrast, transcend the dictates of logic, their observance must be spurred by arousing the inner dimension of the soul, because or else it will be too challenging for him. My mind doesn't relate to this. He says, but your soul will awaken your soul. That can connect to that. Without such inspiration, observance of these mitzvahs will be a function of duty alone, obedience to Hashem's decrees. If these mitzvahs are not internalized, a Jew will carry them out only because he must. Since he does not relate to them, his observance will lack inner vitality. For a person to internalize these mitzvahs and be motivated to perform them with internalized vigor, he must arouse the inner dimensions of his soul, a dimension that transcends intellect. Part 2. True. Our sages state, Hamaisu ha'ikr, deed is most essential, emphasizing that the actual observance of a mitzvah is of fundamental importance. For example, with regard to the mitzvah of tefillin, and the entire Torah is equated with tefillin, so therefore the fact that the Rebbe brings an example from tefillin is not just limited to tefillin, it applies for the whole Torah. Were a person to have in mind all the spiritual intentions, kavonos, associated with the mitzvah of tefillin, but fail to actually bind tefillin to his head and arm, he has not performed the mitzvah and is considered in a category of a karkafted leimonach tefillin, a skull on which tefillin have not been placed. If, by contrast, a person were to put on tefillin, even without considering the intent of the mitzvah, without kavanah, he fulfills the mitzvah. This applies even when a person is advanced enough to be capable of focusing his kavanah's intent, yet fails to do so. Although he fulfills the mitzvah in a perfunctory manner when he does the mitzvah without intention, he still must recite a bracha, a blessing beforehand, that mention Hashem's name and His sovereignty, what's called Shem U'Malchus, Baruch Ato Hashem, Elokeinu Melech HaOlam. This is the basic language of a bracha, and that can be and should be said even if he has no intention, as long as he did the physical mitzvah. The lack of higher intention does not detract from the fact that the mitzvah has been observed. The same applies with regards to other mitzvahs. If he does it without intention, he makes a bracha and fulfills the obligation, because hamaisa or ikir, the deed is most essential. Nevertheless, this emphasis on the deed is not meant to exclude thought or feeling and say, okay, hamaisa or ikir, don't think, don't use your mind, don't use your kavanah. On the contrary, God's will, Hashem's will, is that the mitzvahs permeate every dimension of our character, encompassing all the potentials which we possess. A mitzvah should affect not only one's power of action and speech, which is the limbs with which one's and organs with which one performs a mitzvah. They do the mitzvah with their hands, let's say, or they do other mitzvahs with their mouth. But that's not the only powers of the soul that the person has to use in the performance of the mitzvah. But also it should incorporate one's powers of thought, machshava, emotion, and intellect, and even the encompassing powers of will and pleasure. All these powers are to be permeated by Hashem's mitzvahs. Moreover, this does not only apply to those mitzvahs that are of a general nature and fundamentally depend on the feelings of our hearts and our power of comprehension. You could say there are mitzvahs that have to do with our minds and our hearts. So, of course, those have to be involving our higher faculties. For example, the mitzvahs of love of Hashem, fear of Hashem, faith in Hashem, knowledge of Hashem, and the like. But that's not the only mitzvahs that need to involve our higher capabilities, powers, and faculties. Instead, all mitzvahs, even those entirely dependent on action, must permeate every aspect of our personalities, including our deepest potentials, including and especially that of inner heartfelt pleasure. In other words, we should be permeated with fulfilling the mitzvah with a pleasure of Hashem and a pleasure in the mitzvah. Indeed, every mitzvah, whichever it might be, must be observed with happiness and joy. We don't just say certain mitzvahs have to do with happiness. Every mitzvah. That means that we are tapping into our highest, most faculty of tainug, of delight. As alluded to in the verse, all the choice parts, kol chelav l'Hashem, should be given to God. This means the choice parts doesn't just mean, like over there he's talking about a carbon, or like the Rambam explains, Halacha explains that we should always build, let's say, a shul from the nicest materials. It should be nicer even than our own home, etc., etc. But it means the choicest parts within us. What's the choicest parts within us? Our higher faculties, not just to serve Hashem with our hands and our feet and our mouth, but to use our mind and our heart and our emotions and even the joy and delight that is even higher than our mind and our heart. Accordingly, since their observance is mandated by the Torah, the chukim, in addition to the Mishpatim, must be fulfilled not only with our powers of action, but the importance of their observance must resonate within our minds. They should not be regarded as mere imperatives observed because we have no choice. So we're just doing it in action. I'm putting my mind aside, not even using my mind. That's not the way we should do it. We should not feel that since Hashem issued a decree, we must carry it out, even when it appears to be without reason or purpose. Instead, the mitzvahs must permeate, even chukim, must permeate every dimension of our being and all of our soul powers. Since Hashem gave these commandments, even the chukim should be internalized and made part of our thought process. This does not mean to imply that a person should observe the chukim with the understanding that because of his limited intellect, he is unable to grasp the rationale, but he is certain that others smarter than him, and certainly Hashem, who commanded their observance, have a rationale for them. In other words, a person could say to himself, Hashem is much smarter than me, infinitely so. So I'm observing it because I know that someone smarter than me decided that I should do this. That's not the true type of observance of chukim. That's not the meaning of what we were talking about up till now. This attitude does not constitute the true approach to the observance of the chukim. Observing chukim in this manner does not reflect the consummate approach to Kabbalah's oil, translated in English, the acceptance of oil Malchus Shamayim, the yoke of Hashem's kingship. Such a person has not transcended the limits of his intellect, because the only way how he's justifying this is to say that there's a greater intellect than my intellect. So it's still based on his intellect, appreciating that there's a higher intellect that understands this. On the contrary, his observance is motivated by his trust that the chukim embody such great wisdom that only a truly wise man can comprehend them. That is not the true approach that a person is supposed to have in chukim. Although chukim should be observed solely with Kabbalah soil without making any calculations whatsoever, this approach does not require the denial of one's intellect. At the same time that we're saying it has to be complete Kabbalah soil, we're not doing it because Hashem is smarter than us. On the contrary, but still in all, it still involves our intellect. One's Kabbalah's oil, accepting of the yoke of heaven, must have so much strength and vitality that not only does one's mind not object, but also his Kabbalah's oil influences his mind and spurs it to accept this path. His mind should appreciate that it is necessary to fill Hashem's will without wondering why. Again, it's not that his mind thinks that Hashem's mind is greater than his mind and that's why I'm doing it. His mind appreciates the quality of Kabbalah soil. On this basis, we can appreciate the precision of our rabbi's wording. Chukah, it is a decree. Ein lecha reshus laharer achareh. You do not have permission to question its observance. On the surface, the rabbi should have said, you do not have permission not to observe it. Why is questioning, laharer achareh, mentioned? The answer is that the mere physical observance of such mitzvahs is not sufficient. Instead, one must develop a thoughtful commitment to their observance, to the extent that they resonate within his mind and he does not even think of questioning them. That's how much they permeated his mind, that the mind appreciates that I need to do things with Kabbalah soil. This goes beyond the approach that a person who occasionally thinks the chukim are of no purpose should dismiss this thought immediately. One could say that if such an idea falls into his mind, that why am I doing chukim for? What benefit is there? So I right away push it out of my mind to borrow wording used in Tanya regarding other concepts and other negative thoughts, that if a negative thought falls into his mind, he pushes it away. That's not the true meaning of Ein lecha reshus laharer achareh. You have no permission to question it. The intent is rather that a person who observes chukim properly does not question. Such thoughts never occur to him because of the impact that the way he does it impacts his mind. Instead, he proceeds with a single-minded commitment that knows no doubt. Such a person observes the chukim without a rationale for his observance, not even relying on the explanation that Hashem, God, has surely has a rationale. Moreover, his entire being is so permeated with simple faith in Kabbalah's oil, accepting the yoke of heaven, that this affects his thinking process, and he does not question, chas v'sholom, God forbid. His commitment has pervaded his thinking to the extent that no other approach even occurs to him. He doesn't question. According to this explanation, it is clear that to observe the chukim properly, one must arouse the inner dimensions of one's soul. The third interpretation of Lifneim mentioned above, the one from the Alter Rebbe. It is this potential that enables the chukim to be accepted within the framework of our revealed powers, meaning our minds and our feelings and the light. Otherwise, our mind is like we said before, it would question. It would do it, but it would still question. But when we permeate it to the deepest parts of our soul and arousing the deepest part of our soul, then it brings a state of an unquestioning devotion. Without the influence of his inner dimension, a person will not be able to reach the unquestioning, single-minded commitment described above. It is possible that in actual practice, he will observe the chukim of Kabbalah soil, but his observance will lack vitality, chayis, because he is not aroused the inner part of the soul. He does not have the das and alakus. He does not have the pnimius that we said is the third explanation of Lifneim. When, however, a person arouses the inner dimensions of his soul, he derives satisfaction of joy in his avodas Hashem divine service that transcends the limits of knowledge. This enables him to fulfill the second interpretation of Lifneim, to internalize the Torah's laws and make them a part of the way he thinks and feels, that he doesn't even question. With regard to Mishpatim, by contrast, the lessons of Lifneim are seemingly unnecessary. The mitzvahs classified as Mishpatim are logical and understood by the mind. Thus, a person will naturally derive satisfaction for their observance. So, in other words, it will permeate all of his soul powers, because something that is logical, you don't need to come onto some deeper commitment for the mitzvahs to permeate his entire being. I have my whole being resonates with the idea of honoring parents or not to steal, etc., etc. Why is it necessary for him to arouse the inner dimension of his soul for the observance of these mitzvahs? So, this is still, where, in other words, this strengthens again the question that we asked before: how is this idea of lifneim, needing to awaken the inner part of the soul, applicable to the word mishpatim? 3. The above question can be resolved by first explaining another statement of our Chazal, of the sages, on the verse, and these are the laws. Ve'ela hamishpatim. That's the beginning of our parsha. Seemingly, the Chazal want to know, what's it mean, and these are the mishpatim? What's the and? Our sages comment, these complement those which came before. The vav in ve'ela indicates that the mishpatim come as a continuation of, and as a corollary to the Ten Commandments, the Aseres HaDibros. For the mishpatim were also given at Har Sinai, as the Chazal say, that ma elu misinaf elu, just like those, what says in Parshas Yisro, were from Har Sinai, the Aseres HaDibros, so too these mishpatim. Which means that really mishpatim, what he's going to talk about now, is about continuing the message and the idea of Har Sinai. As mentioned previously, meaning in other Sichos, the Aseres HaDibros, the Ten Commandments, represent a fusion of mitzvahs from both extremes of the spiritual spectrum. The first mitzvahs in the Aseres HaDibros and the Ten Commandments express the deepest concepts of Achdus Hashem, divine unity, while the later ones convey basic dictums such as do not kill and do not steal. These are self-evident and can be grasped even by basic human logic. The fusion of the two in the Aseres HaDibros emphasizes that observance of do not kill and do not steal must also stem from the awareness that they are Hashem's commandments, God's commandments. They were dictated by Hashem, the one who declared, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God your Lord. Those mitzvahs at the end of the Aseres HaDibros need to feel that they are a continuation of, an expression of, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. By saying these complement those which came before, in other words, now at the beginning of our parsha, Ve'ela Mishpatim, our Chazal are implying that the Mishpatim were also given by Hashem on Mount Sinai as a continuation of the all-encompassing experience of the Matan Torah. They are part of the revelation when Anochi, I, and the Chazal say about Anochi, Misha Anochi, the only one who can truly be called I, was made known to the Jewish people. So just like that revelation took place at Matan Torah at Har Sinai, what we're going to learn about in Parshas Mishpatim are also in that continuation of that. As such, they must also be observed not only because their observance makes sense, but because they too were given by Hashem at Har Sinai, like the other half of the Aseres HaDibros that talk about very simple and ordinary things. This is highlighted by the first interpretation of Lifneim, that disputes must be adjudicated before Jewish judges and not before non-Jewish courts. Even when the decisions of a non-Jewish court are identical with those rendered by a Torah court, a Jew is forbidden to approach such a court because its decisions are not associated with the revelation of Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God your Lord. Its rulings are thus not expressions of the laws of the Torah. And every dimension of a Jew's life must be guided solely by the Torah and permeated by it. So for the Mishpatim to be permeated by the Anochi Hashem Elokecha, it must be completely permeated with Torah, and therefore it must be presented any disputes before a Jewish court, not just because a secular court also has, and a civil court has similar laws. This also relates to the Alter Rebbe's interpretation, the third interpretation, of Lifneihem as referring to the inner dimensions of the soul. The intent is that the study and fulfillment of Mishpatim as well should be motivated not only by human logic, but rather by the inner depth of the soul, as is the study and fulfillment of Chukim. Also, with regard to Mishpatim, one must labor that the mind's identification with them should not be compelled by human logic alone, but come as an expression of the inner depths of the soul. The Mishpatim must affect the full range of a person's character to the extent that they become part and parcel of his thought processes, similar to what we said by Chukim, that his thought is permeated with the Hashem's will, and therefore he doesn't even think about questioning. The same thing, Mishpatim has to be in such a way that every single part of his soul, including the Seichel, is in the intellect, and every other part of the soul is permeated with Hashem's will that's in Mishpatim, and that is accomplished by the idea of revealing the inner part of the soul, the Lifneihem, the Pnimius. Based on above, we can appreciate the interrelation between the three interpretations of Lifneihem. Like we mentioned at the beginning of the Sicha, the first question was, what's the connection between all the three different interpretations? And the fact that these concepts are specifically taught in connection with Mishpatim, which is the second question that the Rebbe asked. Since Mishpatim are mitzvahs which can be comprehended by our minds, it is necessary to emphasize that our understanding alone should not motivate their observance. One might think, when we come to Chukim or even Eidos, we do it because Hashem commanded us. But Mishpatim, since we would have derived Mishpatim, like we said that we would have derived not to steal from an ant, so let's do the Mishpatim because it makes sense to us. He says, no. But rather they should be kept because they too were given at Sinai. They have to be permeated by the Anochi Elokecha, like we said before. Ve'ela Mishpatim. It's a continuation of our Sinai. Thus, the Mishpatim must be observed with a Kabbalah soil, inspired by the inner depth of the soul, as per the Alter Rebbe's interpretation. Accordingly, it is forbidden to bring disputes to a non-Jewish court. The first interpretation, for their rulings are based solely on mortal thought, the way a human being thinks. And we're not observing the Mishpatim because it's logical. So human non-Jewish courts have no room for this. So there's no room for them to no role for them to play. Also, although the observance of Mishpatim should be motivated by Kabbalah soil, the observance of these mitzvahs should be internalized within our thinking process. The second interpretation, through the arousal of the inner soul's inner potential, and therefore we also have the level of the panim, the panim of the Torah. 4. The Rebbe now explains why is this actually so. There are two reasons for not relying on human logic in observing the Mishpatim, and therefore the reason bringing disputes before a Jewish court and not a non-Jewish court. And the Rebbe is going to say from the most, if you will, stringent and to the most subtle. Were the observance of these mitzvahs to be dictated by the logic of our nefesh habahamis, animal souls, there would be a tendency towards spiritual descent. We would have a yirida, what's called nechsidus. As implied by our sage's statement, Hayoim omer lo yaseh kach, ulemocher omer lo yaseh kach. Today, the Yetzer Hara tells a person, do this. Tomorrow it tells him, do that. Ad she'omer lo lech avoid avodah zarah, until it tells him, go worship false deities. My revered father-in-law, in other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe explains that first, the Yetzer Hara does not have the boldness to entice a Jew to sin, chas v'sholom, God forbid. Therefore, when it first approaches him, it speaks about a mitzvah. The Yetzer Hara, the Rebbe sometimes uses the expression, wears a silken kaftan, a seidene zupitze. It tells him, do mitzvahs. When the Jew wants to perform a mitzvah, the Yetzer Hara tells him, do this, asei kach. Do what the Torah commands. But when a person fulfills a mitzvah, not because Hashem commanded it, but because the Yetzer Hara tells him do this, meaning because his nefesh habahamis, his animal soul, deems it beneficial to do so, and not because Hashem commanded him to do so in the Torah, he thereby severs his connection with Hashem. From then on, it is possible for the Yetzer Hara to entice the person to descend lower and lower. Tomorrow it will tell him do that, and ultimately it will tell him go worship false deities. So that's how dangerous and how much of a slippery slope there is when we have the logic of the nefesh habahamis, of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, telling the person do a mitzvah. We are supposed to do the mitzvah not because the nefesh habahamis likes it, but because Hashem told us to. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. B, another reason the observance of mitzvahs may not be motivated only because of the dictates of mortal wisdom is even if it won't deteriorate, even if there's no slippery slope, is that even when the person actually observed the mitzvahs, his observance will lack a fundamental element. The awareness of the connection that stems from and is established with Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God your Lord. The word mitzvah is related to the word savsa, meaning connection. He's lacking that connection. I'm doing it because it makes sense to me. I'm not doing it to serve Hashem. I'm not doing it as a connection to Hashem. A person who observes mitzvahs only because of human wisdom will not appreciate that his observance derives from and is an expression of the Torah's mandates, and that their fulfillment connects him to Hashem. He continues in 5. As mentioned previously, the fusion of the two extremes in the Aseres HaDibros and the Ten Commandments teaches a twofold lesson. A, to borrow the words of the Medrash, that by Matan Torah, El Yoinim Yordul Tachtoinim V'Tachtoinim Yal El Yoinim. The higher realms should descend to the lower realms. In the analog, the spiritual powers, meaning the nimshal, the spiritual powers embodied in the commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, and Lo Yeh L'cha Elokim Acherim, you shall have no other gods, must descend and be felt in the observance of the Dibros commandments, Lo Sirtzak, do not kill and do not steal. Even these mitzvahs should be observed because they were commanded by Hashem himself, as we mentioned before. That's the concept that the Medrash uses in a different thing about Matan Torah, that El Yoinim Yerul Tachtoinim, even the loftiest ideas has to permeate even the lowest types of commandments, not to kill and not to steal. There's another thing. There's the Tachtoinim Yal El Yoinim B, the lower realms are to ascend to the higher realms. In the analog, the Nimshal, the term lower realms refers to people who by nature are even less developed than animals and thus do not learn the prohibitions against theft from an ant. In other words, they're so low that if not for Hashem telling them, don't steal, they wouldn't have even had the seichel on their own to learn it from an animal. In other words, they're even lower than the ant, that the ant knows not to steal, and he doesn't even know not to steal before Hashem told him to. They must be commanded do not kill and do not steal by Hashem, who declared, Anochi Havai Elokecha, I am God your Lord, meaning they relate to his essence, the level of Anochi, I, the only one who can truly be called I, Anochi Misha Anochi. Otherwise, they would not observe these prohibitions. So they are real tachtonim. They are really in a low place. Even such individuals, their level of tachtonim has to be yalu le'elyonim, must ascend to the higher realms and develop their faith through the contemplation and knowledge of godliness, alikus, in order to establish a connection with Hashem and indeed with His essence. I, Anoichi, the only one who can truly be called I, Misha Anoichi. In other words, even a very low person has to devote himself to studying the inner parts of the Torah, to appreciate who Hashem is. You're going to say, this person wouldn't even know not to kill on his own. Yes, even such a tachton has to be oilol yoin. These two directives are emphasized again at the beginning of Paras Mishpatim, which, as mentioned above, based on our sage's statements, these complement those which came before, that the Eila is Moisif al Rishonim, like the Chazal say, is a continuation of the giving of the Torah of Matan Torah. As stated previously, one of the lessons of this teaches that even the observance of Mishpatim must be lifneihem, inspired by the inner depth of the soul. This reflects the al yoinim yedul tachtoinim, the descent of the higher realms into the lower realms. So that's the lifneihem, going to the deepest part of the soul through revealing the das and alakus that we mentioned at the beginning of the Sicha. Simultaneously, we are also instructed that the lower realms must ascend to the higher realms. Even those who are in the lower realms, students who have a minimal knowledge of the Torah and who do not have the ability to make distinctions, must be shown how to study, with everything prepared for them as a table set before a person ready for him to eat. We need to lay it out for them in the best way possible. You need to elevate them. You need to bring them to a higher understanding of the Torah, not just say, the Torah said so, that's it, and stop right over there. Moreover, this can also refer to those who are lowly with regard to their conduct and moral development, such as litigants who occasionally advance false arguments. Although the word lifneihem, before them, refers to the judges, it also relates to the litigants, since it is speaking about disputes. That's the simple meaning of the Mishpatim that they have. They're dealing with disputes. That's a lot of the parsha is talking about. These lowly individuals are also commanded to ascend to higher realms. They must be exposed to the treasure trove of Pnimius HaTorah, the Torah's inner mystery core, even though they are in such a state that at least one of the litigants often is ready to even say a falsehood. So even someone of that level has to be brought up to the highest level and be taught about the highest understanding. There is no question if it is appropriate to share these teachings with them. You can say, hold on, such holy, divine words and such inner teachings of the Torah we should share with someone that brings disputes to Bezdin, with people that are arguing, with people that are litigants, with people that might say things false. It's not a question about that. For when looking lifneim at the inner dimensions of the soul, all Jews are potentially worthy, even someone that may be even saying falsehood. And therefore they are fit to receive these treasures, the Torah's deepest teachings. Although the inner dimension of the soul is hidden within such people, it is within their capacity to reveal it, and we are obligated to help them. And this is accomplished by placing it before them. Tosim lefneim. We need to prepare it, like we said, like a table set out with all the food ready. We don't give them, flour and say, go bake the bread yourself. We prepare a full table, and thus exposing them to the Torah's treasures. This will awaken, by exposing them to the Torah's treasures, will awaken and reveal the inner dimension of their souls to an even greater degree, and motivate this inner potential to permeate their conscious powers of thought and feeling. They will be empowered to internalize it, to place it in their hearts, and this will also affect their conduct, leading to the observance of the mitzvahs with energy and vitality. They will then, as it says, v'chai behem, they will then live in them.